Hello, everyone, either in person at Owen or joining us via Zoom. Thank you so much for joining our first Lunch and Learn in our new Voices of Entrepreneurship speaker series. So for those that don't know me, I'm Stacy Pawlicki. I'm the director for the Center for Entrepreneurship, also known as the C4E. And the C4E is really a connection point for students or alumni who want to access the skills, the resources, or the funding to launch and grow businesses, join a rapidly growing startup, or pursue a career on the venture capital side. And so we host a variety of different programming and opportunities throughout the year, including things like pitch competitions. We have various grants and scholarships we give out. We host an annual conference every year in February. And then we also host events such as this one. So the goal of the Voices of Entrepreneurship speaker series is really to share stories and highlight learnings from individuals who have been at the front line of entrepreneurship. So this includes founders, startup leaders, and venture capitalists. And so every month we're going to be hosting these events, and there'll be a virtual option along with an in-person option, and welcoming guests to share with us their experiences through casual conversation over lunch. And so today we're really thrilled to have our first guest speaker, Daniel Rosenzweig. Did I say Rosenzweig correctly?
Yeah, that you nailed it.
Awesome. And Daniel's joining us from New York City. And so he graduated from Vanderbilt in 2011 with a degree in economics and history. And Daniel started his career as a real estate analyst at Alvarez and Marsal, and then later became an early WeWork employee. And currently, Daniel is the co-founder of Kettle. And he's going to tell us all about Kettle, so I won't spoil it. Just before we dive into starting our conversations, I do want to share just a couple of housekeeping items. So anyone that is joining us via Zoom, if you would please make sure to keep yourself muted. We are going to be saving time a little bit later in the hour to open it up for questions. And so at that time, if you have a question you want to ask, it is a pretty small, intimate group, so you can feel free to either raise a hand or unmute yourself and be able to ask your questions at that point. Also, we welcome you to take notes if something is inspiring. We will also be recording this session and sharing it afterwards. So if you miss something, definitely we'll be able to access the recording as well. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind just kind of kicking it off and walking us through your career path to entrepreneurship post-graduation. I know probably a lot of people are curious. Did you always know you wanted to be an entrepreneur? When did you discover this was a path you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, so short answer is no. I think the first time I ever considered it was actually when I was a senior at Vanderbilt. The Facebook movie, The Social Network, came out, which was a complicated story told in a very compelling way. And that was the first time I had thought about doing a sort of nonlinear career. But growing up in the Northeast, I'd sort of considered financial services as the only path. And it clearly is not. So I think graduating, I'll just quickly, so I graduated in 2011. I did some internships in financial services, but the job market, as I think every person who ever graduated says, was not great. So I interned at a hedge fund first in relationship management, and then I landed at Alvarez and Marsal doing bankruptcy and restructuring work. So the first project I worked on there was the Lehman estate. So Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. I don't know, raise your hand if you heard about this, or it kind of goes, okay, we got a couple. All right, cool. So largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the world. So there was a lot of complicated stuff going on. So I was on the real estate team helping unwind the real estate portfolio there, which had 1 million claims on the estate, meaning that 1 million different entities were saying that they were owed money. So it actually took years to unwind. This was back in, the bankruptcy occurred in 2008. I still think people are working on the project today. So it's been long and complicated. But I worked on, while at A&M, I worked on everything from the Lehman estate. I worked on the Detroit City bankruptcy. I worked on the state of Louisiana, helping them get a little bit smarter about their real estate portfolio. And then finally, and I think most relevant to my next job was we were hired by the New York City Economic Development Corporation to assess New York City's ability to attract and retain tech talent moving forward. Because after '08, financial services sort of took a dive, and looking at its cohort of other cities, right? San Francisco was certainly seeing a lot of uptick from tech, right, and growth in a lot of tax dollars, et cetera. And Boston was actually beating New York as well. So New York was trying to compete, and so we worked with the Bloomberg administration to come up with some recommendations for them. That's actually where I first met Adam Newman, who is the infamous founder of WeWork, who I actually went to go work for soon after on the real estate team. I was there from 2014 to 2016, did all their global underwriting, which is a fancy way of saying running the financial model to understand the viability of different locations. And then I moved on to site selection. So going to a city, finding the buildings we wanted to be in, negotiating those deals, and then handing it off to the construction team to go build. So I left in 2016 and I started Kettle, which is my company that still is mine today. And our goal was to, I don't know if compete with WeWork, but we sort of saw the future of work evolving because technology is a really strong catalyst for all this. And I used to go to the office every day when my filing cabinets were there, and also my phones were there, fax machines, everything used to be there. But now, because of computers and our phones and the technology infrastructure, you kind of can do that stuff from anywhere. And so the idea of working from, in a hybrid fashion became more realistic. And so the idea there was, how can we help companies that are as largest enterprises in the world, and then small individual contributors, right, who are either freelance or entrepreneurs themselves, get access to great spaces too, right? And so that's where I started Kettle Space, which was partnering with hotels, restaurants, and other underutilized spaces during the day and making them available as co-working spaces. So for $50 a month, you get access to a whole network of locations. You'd walk in, you'd automatically connect to the Wi-Fi. The coffee would be free and you could drink as much of it as you wanted. And most importantly, you get access to community of other folks just like you who you could work along with, you could help, etc. So that's Kettle Space. Going into COVID, we had close to 40 locations, close to 7,000 members in New York, and a couple of $1 million in revenue. And I'll sort of cut it off there, but that's sort of the nonlinear path that led me to entrepreneurship, which was seeing an opportunity, seeing challenges to it, and knowing that I could do it slightly better myself.
Awesome. So I know you mentioned starting Kettle kind of in your WeWork experience, identifying potentially a problem or a need or, kind of this trend that you were talking about. Were there certain moments or maybe when did you figure out, okay, I want to start this business? And what was that process?
Completely. So it's sort of like, I think a lot of you either have had this moment or you haven't before, where an idea, it comes from nowhere and it starts like sitting in your brain, and then it starts like resonating and burning a hole in your pocket at some point, right? Like, especially when you've got, maybe you're not in school anymore, or you're working in your career, and you become familiar with this concept of opportunity cost, right? Which is sort of an economics concept of the cost of doing a thing or not doing a thing, right? And they can both be very real. And so for me, the cost of not acting became too high in my own calculation, and so it made sense for me to go and pursue it based on sort of what the market was telling me, where I thought the world was going, and how useful I thought I could be to help other people in that moment.
Awesome. So before we jump specifically into Kettle, because that is obviously where we want to focus the majority of our time, I want to jump back to WeWork a bit, just because arguably WeWork is probably one of the most popular entrepreneurial stories for very many reasons.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like any experiences or lessons learned, or anything that you took away from that experience that you feel like has benefited your own entrepreneurial journey?
Completely. So a lot of stuff happens to us in life, and sometimes it's good stuff, and sometimes it's not so good, right? And I think our job is to assess these things in real time and determine like what do we want to take away from this. So um, there some of the positives of what I learned there, right? Um, One, how inefficient the real estate world generally was, right? How the movement to everything as a consumer product sort of made sense, right? Especially these entities that only transacted once every 10 to 15 years, right? In order for them to remain viable, they needed to create an environment that people actually wanted to be in, right? So they sort of didn't understand who their customer actually was. Um, and then, so those are some of the good things, right? People operating more flexibly, budgets going a lot to real estate that maybe like real estate and people problems being seen as two different things. Whereas the only reason you ever have real estate is to solve people problems, right? In order to bring my team together, to help us facilitate collaboration, and not real estate, the office for the sake of having an office, right? And I think that changed when technology removed the requirement of the office as the only locus of people, acting and working together. On the flip side, from a culture standpoint, from a management standpoint, like there's a lot of stuff that was lacking, right? And I think in hindsight, all of that stuff is super obvious, right? There was a lot there that didn't jive well with me. So the transition out was just logical. It made a lot of sense at that point in time. And you can read the book and watch the TV show and all that, right? There's I mean, I haven't watched it. For me, it's like, it probably hits a little bit too close to home. But I also realized the leader that I wanted to be, and also learn like how not to act around other people. And I think both are equally important. And so those are some of the lessons I took from my WeWork experience.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just that idea of kind of these nuggets of wisdom that you can collect as you're having experiences in early startups and then apply it to your business when you start it.
Totally. You don't have to, but otherwise it's a waste, right? So it's important to like keep these things, and add them to your toolkit.
Yeah. And so what was your experience? So remind us again, what year did you start Kettle?
Late 2016. So September, we incorporated in July and we opened our doors in September.
Got it. So obviously, you were a couple years in business when the pandemic hit. What was your experience like running a startup during the pandemic, especially one that, initially kind of relied a lot on humans kind of being in person or going places?
Together. For sure. So I'll sort of break it into parts because it's a little bit like, I don't know, if they made a movie, it would be super dramatic and you could probably just cover the first few days. But I think everyone in this room, we all remember where we were when we started hearing about the news around COVID-19. And it was just like a news story. And then it was like something that was completely, I mean, at least where I was, right, sitting in New York, it was just like it was still amorphous, it was still intangible. And then it slowly started becoming more and more real. So for us as a business, we were like, first it was just like something we like would talk about on the side. And then it became like a point that was in meetings. And then all of a sudden it was like the most important thing that we would discuss the whole time, right? Like part of the reason we are still alive today is because of some of the pragmatic moves we made to protect ourselves, our members, our locations, and our investors in the very, very early days of COVID. Like we acted very quickly. We basically turned off revenue in one day, right? It was March 20th. We went from a multi-million-dollar business to zero overnight because it no longer was safe for our members, right, to be together in person, right? So that was challenging. It's literally the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And in hindsight, it's obvious, right? Like that was the only logical, pragmatic move at that point. But something that you've built, right, like from the ground up, 4 years in the making, and you're finally, right, like as an entrepreneur, there's always goals you set. And we were at one of those like pivotal moments where we really were like breaking through a multi-million, like getting from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, like starting to accelerate. And, as some people like to say, like we make plans, God laughs, right? Like that's sort of what we had to deal with. So that was a tough time, right? So we had a team of 25 that overnight became a team of 10. And a lot of the folks we kept were some of the people with us from day one, right? Who literally put their hearts and souls and blood and sweat and tears into this, just like me, just like my co-founders. And with no revenue, we were able to keep the whole team intact until the end of 2020. And then we had to basically, you cut muscle, to use a metaphor, right? Like you cut muscle, then you start cutting into bone. And so we had a lot of really hard decisions. I mean, I don't know if it makes me feel better, but like everyone, we were all on the same page. Like there were no, like, it broke my heart to let some of these folks go. And they were like, Dan, it's okay. Like we understand, but it's still like, I was the one crying in the meeting. But again, that's not the point here. Isn't to like feel bad for Dan. It's more to just be like, these decisions are very real. And when we talk, sometimes in the work world, we talk about like a work family. And in the startup game, like you really feel that because you spend so much time with these people and you are, right, like you're not getting market rates. Like you're underpaid, you're grinding, you're working more than others, and you're trying to build and manifest something that no one else can see, that doesn't exist, right? So it takes a lot of heart to get there. And sometimes that heart gets ripped out. So COVID, right? Like just to sort of put a bow on this, was super challenging. The pivot, right? Which I think we could sort of get into if you wanted to talk about that, like, cause we're a different company now. We actually sold off our space operations business in February to a company out of DC, and we're exclusively a SaaS software company. Does everyone know what SaaS means? Like raise your hand if you know what SaaS is. Okay, I don't know if the microphone's on. Does someone want to shout it out?
Software as a service.
That's right. Software as a service, right? SaaS is a way of saying this is software that we used to need like a disk for. Like that's how AOL used to like send all those things. Maybe I'm dating myself by talking about that stuff. Now it's just a website. Like you can just go on, you can use the software. You can download an app. That's SaaS. So we sell to enterprises now. And so, I mean, should I get more into what we do now, or how do you want to use the time?
Yeah. So maybe kind of parallel or kind of leading into that. So when you initially conceptualized Kettle Space, if you could talk about like the initial concept a little bit more, kind of that first 4 or so years of the growth, and then talk a little bit about how I know you mentioned from a team perspective that immediately had to change, but what other sort of changes got you to the place that you are now?
Totally. Okay, so first I'll talk about the beginning years, which was literally me walking into hotels and restaurants and starting conversations with people and saying like, I see those seats are empty. What times do you get busy, et cetera, right? Like when you're first starting out, trying to get like proof of concept in some way, like that's what it takes. You just need to be willing to put yourself out there and start talking to folks to gather information. We opened in September in a restaurant that down in Tribeca in NYC, that a family friend who I pitched the concept to was like, you got to go meet these guys. They had a beautiful restaurant. They're paying rent 24/7. They were only open for dinner. And so during the hours of 9 to 5, they had this beautiful restaurant with floor to ceiling windows located right off the 1 train in New York. Like, so from a location standpoint, all the stuff I would look for in a WeWork location, it checked all those boxes, but it was just sitting there empty all day. Meanwhile, there were 2 cafes nearby that were packed all day long, right? So the idea was, how can we create a better experience for people that's more centered around community as opposed to coffee consumption, which is sort of how cafes operated. So that's where it started. And from there, we grew to 2 locations, 3 locations, 5, right? And it took years to get there. And the goal here was to sort of move supply and demand together, right, in real time, right? Because we were a real estate company, but I didn't sign leases, right? I would create a license agreement with anyone on the supply side. So that's how we grew. And we were like boots on the ground, talking to people, a lot of word of mouth growth from a user standpoint, but we were selling to individual consumers. So right, B2C, as using the work jargon. Over time, we started becoming more B2B focused because co-working, the industry overall was starting to try and justify like why it would exist long term. And they wanted the credit and the long-term commitment of larger enterprises. So going into COVID, we actually were 50-50 between larger companies like iHeartMedia, as an example, who signed up their sales team so that they could pop into any of our 25 locations in Manhattan proper, right? Or and then the others were a lot of freelancers, web developers, et cetera, who kind of worked for themselves. But that ecosystem was great because you had folks meeting each other, supporting each other. There are people today who are still really good friends or colleagues who met at a Kettle location. And so, it makes me feel a little better, even though, things sort of went sideways during COVID. So that's sort of the story of Kettle Space, right?
Dan, can I ask you a quick question too? Not to interrupt you, but did you raise any capital during
we did
4 years?
So we raised a friends and family round, and then we raised 2 rounds of capital, like a pre-seed and then a seed. We were actually going out for our Series A in March of 2020. So timing not ideal. Excuse me. That said, I can explain a little bit more about the fundraising process or any of that if
anything that you feel would be beneficial. And then you can talk a little bit about the pivot, if that makes sense.
Totally. So fundraising, very, very challenging. I'd highly recommend, right? Like as a founder, as someone who's gone through the pain of raising capital, because it's very, very challenging, especially if you don't have a prior exit, right? So a lot of VCs are looking for pattern matching. And if you've already had a success, it de-risks the overall thing. You're more likely to be successful in the future. Makes sense. For someone like myself who had never done that, it's really hard to get someone to see your vision and see you as the person who's able to execute it, right? Like over time, now that we're 6+ years in, it's an easier conversation because people know that I'm in it to win it. But especially from the onset, like ideas, right? Like, I don't know if you guys follow Gary Vaynerchuk, but one of his famous quotes is like, ideas are a dime a dozen, execution is everything, right? And I think he curses more when he says it, but like, it's true. Like you could have the same idea as someone else. And as founders, you're like, we all think the idea is everything. And like someone, if they hear it, they might steal it. Like it takes so much effort, even if you have the best idea of all time, so much effort to manifest, to execute, to convince people to quit their jobs, to take way less money to come join you and put everything on the line for whatever it is that your core mission is. So what I would say is it's really hard. From a venture standpoint, raising venture capital is really difficult. We've done it. I still would recommend if you can bootstrap the thing on your own, do it every time, 100% of the time, because you retain your interests and your investors' interests, while seemingly aligned, sometimes don't line up, especially when things get really hard. And I know several examples of founders who had exit opportunities that weren't seen as good enough from the venture standpoint, so they were rejected. So it's really important. This is just like anything else you do. The better you know the person, the background, the history, like the good and the bad, right? Because like my favorite like we had a board meeting this morning as an example, right? Like our lead investor is a venture capitalist, right? Like he bleeds for us, right? Like, and that's the kind, like he is, I would sign up with him every single time, right? Like, but he's one of many. So it's not to say that all VCs are the same. They're not. And the truth is they probably look at this and say like, well, he hasn't had a big exit yet. So like, c'est la vie. But if you can do the thing yourself, do it. If you retain ownership, you retain the control. Yeah, I would do it by myself as long as I could. I couldn't because now we're a software company, so I can't code, right? Like that's one of if I went back and did it again, I'd probably be a CS major or something like that. But that's why I focus on my comparative advantage, which is managing effectively, selling, building partnerships, fundraising, all that other stuff.
Got it. So it sounds like too, if you are going to fundraise, make sure you find partners that you culturally align with too, because you're saying your investor would bleed for you, right? There's that level of of relationship that's built to there.
Well, you gotta want to be with them on your worst day, right? Like, because most of it's not sunshine and rainbows. Most of it's like grit and just like grinding through stuff. And if they're willing to get and level with you and empathize and get in there with you, right? That's great, right? Like, because it's not always just about the money. Sometimes it's about the relationships or their network or something else. And it's hard. It's also hard for them, right? Like, it's hard to know who's for real and who isn't, right? They don't have a crystal ball. So that's why they look for, patterns, generally speaking.
Got it. So that's super helpful. So, you've got the team, you've been growing locations, you've got some investment, then, March 2020 happens. Talk about that pivot, if you will. You talked about the team piece, but anything else around business model, basically how you come to being a SaaS company now.
For sure. So when March 2020 hit and we had sort of gone through that transition into like what I call like cockroach mode, just like survive, right? And that was both important for us as a business, but also for my team members, right? Like individually. It was hard on all of us. We can look around and be like, yeah, dude, that was tough. COVID was hard, right? Like, I'm a type A person and I draw a lot of my energy from being around other people. And it wasn't the most fun. That said, we started talking to as many people as we could, heads of HR, heads of real estate, even just individuals, just to try to understand, like, how are you thinking about, like, say COVID was over tomorrow, like, would you go back to the office full time? Would you continue working remotely? And I think as long as COVID continued to sort of extend and we all built ourselves like a nice work from home environment, right? Like, the value proposition started changing between needing an office or just, needs versus nice to haves. And I think the key differentiator here versus COVID, like pre-COVID, is everyone's got a nice, like, most people have in the knowledge-based economy have like a pretty good work from home setup. It might not be perfect, right? But it's pretty good. And so the value proposition of going back to the office needed to change, because we don't go to the office for better chairs or even for lunch, right? Like, and again, that was the thing. It's very market specific. In San Francisco, if you don't serve lunch, you're never going to hire anyone. Whereas in New York, if you serve lunch, you're like, you're ahead of the game. That's just sort of how the market exists. So for companies, they now can think a little bit more critically about how they bring people together and why they bring people together, as opposed to it making sense for everyone to spend 2 hours commuting every day just cause. So I think, right, as some other people like to say, never waste a good crisis, right? Like, crises like this give us an opportunity to audit what we do. And it's something that I love talking to my team about, right? Like, even pre-COVID was like, if we have a system that you don't think makes sense, question it, come up with something better, and let's keep moving forward. And I think how we work together, how we cope, right? Like, how you're all in a room together, like, that's great. I think it's pretty cool. Like, we're also remote. So for me to fly to Nashville to do this didn't necessarily make sense based on what I had to do, but we're still here together, right? So this allows us to have our cake and eat it too, right? And I think there are some and this is all the stuff we were hearing. If this is the spectrum of work and you've got 80% that you do solo and 20% that you do collaboratively with other people, and everyone's ratio is slightly different, right? The alone work, for the most part, you could do from home or from a library or somewhere solo. You don't have to be in the same room as other people. The stuff you're doing together, you can decide either to do via Zoom, right? You could do it, go to a park and meet together. If you need a whiteboard, you need a conference room, right? Like, but like, there are lots of environments that exist that can help create that outside of just the typical office environment. So the way we look at stuff is, how can we help people, right, have their cake and eat it too, by understanding when other people are planning to be in the office. Because if I know what my partners are planning to do, it makes sure that when I go to the office, right, like, they're going to be there too. And so I didn't just go for the sake of going. I went because there's stuff that we can do together that might not be as effective remotely. And it could be a brainstorm. It could be a board meeting. It could be a one-on-one. It could be onboarding a new employee. It could be mentorship. Like, everyone's going to have their own answer to that question. And that's why we built a flexible system to allow each person to decide for themselves what makes the most sense for them based on where they live, whether they have children, whether they're close to the office or not, et cetera, right? So we all can be collectively better off. And also that doesn't even go with the savings of time, which is massive. But also like, you know, if any people who are environmentally focused, like huge carbon savings, right? Like there's a lot of very smart things we can do by just questioning why we're doing things the way we are.
So talk about, if you could just take a minute to just talk about like, what can a user expect when they're using your software, and what's kind of the value prop now versus
completely.
Yeah, now that, you know, you've shifted to this new tech model.
All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, it's simple. The first, what we do, right, is we connect to your calendar, right? Google Calendar, Outlook, etc. Right, and our goal is to make it very easy for you to stay close in touch with your team or your colleagues or your favorites. So if I want to see, if I'm part of the marketing team, I can very quickly see who's in the office today, who's working from home, what are they planning to do tomorrow, right? The day after, et cetera, right? I also, if I click on someone, I can also see, right, do I have meetings coming up with them? If not, and I need to connect with Adam, it would probably make sense for me to schedule something, right? I can also see his plans over the next week so that if I need to be in the same place as Adam, it becomes very, very easy for me to do that, right? So the goal here is to say, all this information, right, exists in lots of disparate places. And we're just trying to honestly find a better way to organize it so that you get the information you need and can make decisions more quickly, right? And then from there, there's a bunch of like intelligence. So once I understand the types of meetings you like to book, whether you always need to be in a room with a whiteboard or you're okay meeting in a cafe or a park or something, then I can take the geography piece in too and say, hey, Stacy, if you're in, I don't know, Brentwood, right, and I'm sitting in Greensboro Village or something, right? Maybe instead of going all the way to the office, it makes sense for us to find somewhere in between, right? And if we need a whiteboard, we'll find an environment that meets that need. But if not, maybe we go to Centennial Park, or, you know, I'm pulling names out of my tuchus, but like that's the idea here is like by being more intentional about how we come together, right? I'm agnostic to space and more focused on us having a good use of our time by being in an environment that's going to be conducive to us being productive, right? So if that makes sense for us to be in a work environment, right, and we have an office, we'll ingest the floor plan from the office, right? This is literally from the TV show The Office as demonstrative here, but you can book conference rooms, private offices, small conference rooms, big conference rooms, board meetings, etc. Right? There's just like a lot of different ways you can divide it to make sure that those rooms are available whenever we want them, right? So one of our largest clients is NYU. NYU uses this both for students to know that if I want to go and reserve a room for I don't know, we're working on a project together and I want to know that that room's going to be available, we manage the whole inventory for them, right? So students know what they're getting. Also for faculty, right? Because they have a hybrid work schedule. So if I'm on if I'm working on, I don't know, I'm on the admissions department, right? And I want to know if my colleagues are planning to be in the office that day or not, right? Like this is a tool that makes it really easy for them to do that. It syncs with everyone's calendars and tries to just save us all brain power and time. So that's Kettle OS, generally speaking.
Awesome.
And so to answer your question, how is it different than our prior product? So this all started with us coming out with our consumer app in March 2020. Like timing, our timing's been impeccable, gotta say. And so what that allowed us to do was very quickly pop open a map, see locations around us, reserve a seat. So when I showed up, I could know that there was a seat there for me. And I'd also know who else was in the space too, because there was a lot of community building and networking that went on. You could probably see how that infrastructure evolved over time into this, which is more of a collaboration tool. But that's where it happened. NYU was like, hey, Dan, we need software because our students, by the way, this is like to flash back, this was summer 2020 and universities, a lot of the value proposition comes from you guys being together, being in the classroom together, building rapport, having a college experience, right? And if all that stuff was forced online permanently, it would really, it would be much more challenging to justify all of that, right? So they were gung-ho on bringing people back. But at that point in time, especially in New York City, right, COVID was rampant, right? There was a lot of fear going on. So the idea was, how can we create a COVID safe way for students to leave their dorms and be near each other, but also not be spreading the virus? And so that's sort of where the initial opportunity came from. And so we created 1,000 COVID safe seats for them in restaurants and hotels around the NYU campus. And then from there, it evolved more to a software play as COVID's sort of the space requirement diminished. And so we evolved with them, and they were one of the leading reasons that we shifted into a SaaS model as opposed to being a space ops model.
Got it. So, and you obviously, in some ways, you kind of had this sign that you needed to pivot your business, right? COVID came, real obvious.
Revenue went from 3 million to 0 overnight. So like, correct, that's one way the market says things are different.
Correct. So maybe yours was a pretty obvious way, right? That the market was hitting you over the head with something that said, oh, you need to evolve. Now, entrepreneurs are always in a situation, right, where they're kind of paying attention to what's going on around them. A lot of times they may experience something where, an ecosystem that they're in is causing, there's a call for a change or a shift in their business, and it may not be as obvious. Are there certain skills or certain things that now, looking back and reflecting, you think are really important for entrepreneurs to pay attention to or keep in their mind that might be giving them information that helps them shift their business, if you will?
Definitely. So I think about every conversation as an opportunity to like ingest some data, right? And so I think if you can remember that, great. If you're like me and you need to like take notes, like please do that, right? So every conversation you have is going to be a data point or a few data points. Our jobs as entrepreneurs is to have as many conversations as we can to ingest as much data as possible, right? Like the unfortunate thing about the world is there is no actually right or wrong answer, right? Like there's another universe where we didn't pivot and we're still fighting the good fight as Kettle space, right? So there's never a perfect answer. However, if you're having trouble selling and getting traction, right? As a founder, our goal is to try and get to product market fit, which is a concept that is, it's one of those things where it's been described to me in two ways. One is it's like love. You know it when you have it, right? When you're in love, you can feel it, but it's hard to describe. Another is when people are begging you to give you their money, right? That's also how it's been described to me. We were getting closer to that prior, but we hadn't necessarily had it. And certainly when the carpet was pulled out from under us, we had to start from scratch again. I would not say we have product market fit today, right? So there's an argument to be made that we continue to evolve moving forward. But I think in terms of how the market has shifted, right, towards hybrid, and how we were well positioned to understand those problems early on. And then also how we're not just in it for like a space booking thing. It's more about trying to help people be smarter about how they spend their time and who they spend it with. But I think those are problems that are going to resonate for a long time. So I think our goal is to solve 10-year problems, not necessarily the today problems, but I need to sell to today problems, right? So that's sort of where the challenge comes in. As a founder, I could talk as high level as I want about where we want to be 10 years from now, but customers don't care, right? They want you to solve a problem for them today, right? So it's a bit of a challenge to find that balance. And so that's why listening to your customers is so important, and potential customers, and understanding why they're saying yes, but also why they're saying no.
Got it. So shifting a little bit to just, on the less on in the business, but also thinking about you, how do you manage the stress that comes with entrepreneurship? Because obviously that sometimes can be the most unspoken piece of starting a business is the stress. How do you prevent yourself from burning out?
So great question. And this is whether you become an entrepreneur or not, like this is just a good question for life. Like, how do you stay excited about a thing when life is challenging and stressful, and there's the stuff you're worried about today, like won't be the things that actually derail me, right? Like, so I think there's a couple things. One, as an entrepreneur, you're only as strong as your network, right? And so before I started Kettle, I literally took out a sheet of paper and wrote pros and cons and like wrote down, okay, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen if I fail, right? What are the pros of going out about and doing this? And I think that simple analysis of pro v con can be very important, right? And so I think doing some of that work, especially up front, right? We're certainly taking risk, but it's calculated risk, right? Like, I did at a point in time before I was married, right? Like now I'm not only married, but I have a young daughter, right? Like my calculation might be different, but I think that's important. Like the more in touch I am with that stuff, the more, the less anxiety or stress that will be between me wishing a thing was different than what it is, right? Two, self-care, right? Like I can't hammer that point enough. And I can like, that's why I'm eating yogurt for lunch and not pizza, because I had too many pizzas in the last few weeks. Like taking care of yourself, the getting enough sleep, right? Like all these things that you've heard a million times, like you got to do it. If you don't, you are going to burn out. And it's going to not only negatively impact you, but also if you have a team at that point, it's going to hurt them, right? It's bigger than, once you start the business and you have a team or you take outside capital or anything, it just cranks up the externalities of everything you do, right? Both positive and negative. I find stuff, so that one thing, so I'm reading a book right now called You Can't Teach a Kid to Ride a Bike at a Seminar, right? And it's a sales book. It's a sales mentality. But one thing I like about it, and I'm only like 10 pages in, they're talking about differentiating yourself from the product, right? So if someone says no, it's not them rejecting you, it's them rejecting the product. Now sitting there like you all are right now, it might make logical sense. But if you put your blood, sweat, and tears into a thing, sometimes you become the thing, at least in your own mind. So sort of putting up some of those barriers can be beneficial as well. And then, I have a business coach, I have a therapist, I have a wife and a family. I read, I do crossword puzzles. Like I find ways to take my mind off of what I'm doing. And some of the best ideas I've had have come from me not working, come from me like walking my dog, doing other stuff. And your brain has a funny way of finding these little interesting ways to talk about a thing slightly differently than you were before. Like that's iteration. That happens all the time. And I've been thinking about this problem literally nonstop for 6.5 years.
Wow. So before we turn it over to questions from the audience, we did have a couple people submit some questions prior to us starting the session. So one of them would be, do you have any advice for balancing a full-time job along with founding a startup simultaneously?
So yes. And I did that, by the way, like when the Kettle space idea started burning a big enough hole in my pocket, like that became my full-time thing, right? I left. I will speak to this from the best of my experience, but there are probably other people who would answer this better than me. I think what you're trying to get when you're moonlighting on this, right, on your business is a better understanding of what the opportunity is more than anything. And it really varies what you're trying to build, right? If you're trying to revolutionize the world of healthcare, it's probably hard to do just at night, just a few hours a day, or I'm just pulling random examples out, versus, I don't know, developing a different sock, right? Which is something everyone's got 2 feet and maybe your path to market's much simpler, right? So it really depends. That said, I think balancing your time between the things you know you have to do and the things you maybe want to do but can sacrifice, right, might be where you find more time for your startup. So and only you know what those answers are. But if it's self-care, if it's like going for a jog, I would keep doing that, right? But if it's maybe going out for drinks and dinner with friends, like maybe do that half as much as you did before. So you're still checking that box, but you're also getting stuff done. So set some goals for yourself, try and hold yourself accountable, but also like cut yourself a little slack because you got a lot on your plate.
Awesome. And another question that came in was, what has been the most challenging obstacle you faced as a founder, and what has been the most rewarding?
Okay, COVID, obviously, well, not obviously, but by far the most challenging. Like, who would have predicted that every one of my customers and potential customers in the whole world would be stuck at home for like 2 years? Couldn't have predicted it. And it's funny, some people, everyone's a Monday morning quarterback. They're like, well, you should have been more resilient. And you're like, how? In what universe? Right? But it's easy, right? This is a great reminder as an entrepreneur, like, unless someone's done the thing, it's very easy to criticize. And so I would just, not all opinions are created equal, and that's okay, right? Like, so sort of understanding where people are coming from and like letting it go in one ear and out the other is an important thing. What's the most rewarding? So many rewarding things. Like, so to use a sports analogy, sometimes when you're working, you're in a locker room and your team is struggling. And if you've ever played sports or not, you've been on a team that isn't doing that well, right? Like, you feel it. It's hard. You really got to work hard to show up. And those are, I mean, that's when your character really gets tested. And then sometimes you're in a winning locker room and everyone's high-fiving, and like that, it's easy to do, right? It's easy to show up and go undefeated. It's really hard to show up when you're getting your face kicked in every day, right? For a long period of time. And COVID felt like getting our face kicked in a lot before we officially pivoted, but even while pivoting, as we're trying to figure out how we talk about the product, et cetera. So the short answer is this pivot has been the most rewarding thing, and seeing customers like light up and be excited about what we do, right? Like having the idea of a thing and then seeing someone else, it makes someone's day better or their lives easier. And you get that feedback and you're like, yeah, that's what I'm here for. That's why I did it, right? And there have been little elements of that throughout the Kettle experience, both as Kettle Space and as Kettle OS as we are today. So I think building something people want is the most rewarding thing I've done.
Awesome. One last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So we have a variety of different people probably listening in. I know we'll have individuals who maybe are starting a business or maybe have started a business and are growing. But then also individuals who maybe want to join a fast growing startup. So interested to get your take, since you did grow a team and you continue to grow teams. Any thoughts on like what characteristics are really important when you're hiring for a startup, and or, you know, any kind of guidance you might give as someone who has hired a variety of team members for your startup?
Yeah, totally. So I've been both a job seeker and a solicitor, right, for these things. So I'll tell you what not to do to start, because sometimes that's an easier thing. So I have a really talented friend who's at a really big company, and he's got a big job. And so he was ready to move a little bit. So he started interviewing at this company and he met the whole team. And then after weeks and weeks and hours of conversations, they came back and said, you know what, we actually don't need this job, right? Like, we're not hiring for this. So don't be respectful of people's time, but also make sure that this is a real need. Because if you're going to wasting your own time, like, fine, like that's on you, but like, don't waste job seekers' time, right? Because there's a million other things they can do. In fact, they also have a full-time job. So job seeking, as you may find, is literally a full-time job in and of itself. And it's very challenging to do. So what I'm looking for, like, honestly, like, I would have people talk to their resume, but especially as an operations business, right? I was looking more for like heart. I was looking for people who were highly empathetic, very high EQ, and would just go the extra mile for people. And so those are the types of questions I would ask, like way less like, hey, like, can you technically do this? And more, tell me about a really challenging time that occurred and how you solved it, or something like that, right? Like, and those are very typical questions, but I really like to get to know the person. But that's me. That's the type of role I was hiring for, right? Like, now as a software company, right, there are more stringent requirements for the types of stuff we're looking for. So I kind of have to adjust based on the role. But still, I'm still looking for someone who I want to spend time in the foxhole with, who's going to, they don't need to have all the answers, because I certainly don't, but we need to be able to work together to try and solve them as best we can. And not everyone is equal when it comes to that.
Yeah. Well, even just that
So,
question around resilience, almost like identifying resilience or identifying some of these more emotional intelligence capacities that'll help when you're in that sort of fast growing phase and things are moving quickly,
yeah.
et cetera.
Resilience in good times and bad. It's resilience is always a really important, important characteristic.
Awesome. All right. Well, if anybody has a question, we would love to open it up to any audience member, whether you're on Zoom or you're in person at Owen. If you've got a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or chime in and ask.
Don't worry, I won't bite, I promise. Anyone have a cool startup idea they're thinking about that they want to bounce off? What brought you guys here today? Like, you just want to hear a cool story? Like, what, I don't know, I'll start in the front, the guy with the very, very cool mustache. What are you doing here today?
Well, I just thought it was a good opportunity to hear about, how your journey after Owen. And I was particularly interested to see how you were able to pivot during COVID, just because a lot of people weren't. So it's pretty cool to see that you successfully were.
Thanks. Very cool. Welcome. Excited.
Yeah.
How about who else? Other people? Maybe someone in the back. How about the one right behind him in the maroon shirt that I could see there? What brought you here today?
I think that's me, right?
It could be either one of you. I want to hear from everyone.
I mean, I would tell you, I have a co-founder who's here in the room. We're working on a med device. We're both actually PhD students, chemical engineers. And it's been challenging, kind of having a full-time thing and trying to build a startup. So yeah, I wanted to hear about your experience. And
yeah, on the moonlighting, I hope my moonlighting answer probably wasn't perfect for you guys, but like, you're also, as a medical company, you're in like the perfect place to do it. So yeah, just find as many advisors as you can. Like, that would be, I know you didn't ask for the advice, but there's so many really smart people on campus.
I would ask you a question. When's the best time to go and talk to VCs? And if you can't bootstrap, we don't really have much money going on. So
you can talk to them anytime you want, right? Like, the question is like, so when you're raising, if you ask someone for money, even if it's their job to give money, they rarely want to, like, they say no 99.9% of the time. The best way to get money is to ask for advice. Generally speaking, this is like it's like a hack of the century, right? Like, no one wants to give money. I don't know why. It's a strange ecosystem. So, I mean, start talking to them. They're going to ask you, like, the questions they'll ask. If you can't answer them, good. Like, go find answers to those questions. Because they're going to ask the same questions that every other VC is going to ask, right? And plus or minus 20%, right? So you'll start to understand how they think about the world, which I think is super valuable, right? Like, understanding they're not your customer, right? Like, but they are a person in the ecosystem, right? So they're a necessary evil to some extent, right? Unless you could bootstrap this thing yourself, you're going to need them. And they can provide, in theory, capital and advice and a network, right, that you could sell into. So start talking. Like, I would talk to them if you can get on their calendar, just like bring some good questions. Like, one thing I'd like to say to folks who I work with, it's like, it's okay to ask questions. Just like, show me how smart you are with the question you're asking. Not like, where's something that we've already talked about 50 times. Like, show me some like next level thinking. And you can, like, in your answers, but also in the questions you're asking them, right? You can show how thoughtful you are, and you can differentiate yourself from other conversations they're having. So like, you're sitting in, I don't know, like the perfect place to do a medical startup. And I would take serious advantage. But also, like, do you have advisors yet?
Yeah, we are working with an MD from VUMC, from the medical center here, and somebody who worked with Pfizer who's outside of the circle of Vanderbilt. So
I've heard of those guys. Yeah. Well, good. So just keep doing that. And then also talk to more people, right? Like, it's better than having one advisor, two, right? Get as many opinions as you can, right? Like you don't need to have an official board of directors to have a board meeting where you get people together and you talk about a thing and you hear their like they'll engage with each other. Like everyone's light bulbs start going off. It's a really fun environment to be in. Even like today was a tough one. But it was still, I live for that stuff because they're going to analyze what we're doing, one with like a really sharp view of stuff. And like, they're not there to be your friend. Right. But also they're right. Like a lot of times I don't want to see these things, but they're right. And so sometimes you got to make hard decisions. So anyway.
Anybody on Zoom have a question too? Open it up.
I have a question. I'm the co-founder. So when you pivoted during COVID, and why did you decide to pivot and not just exit? And do you have an exit strategy? And when do you want to stop working on this?
Okay, I'll answer them in reverse. Technically never, because this is something I really care about. And I have some family members who have lived, not mine, but I married into, that have lived to like 100 and they still work, right? Like that's how they lived to 100, was by finding something that they cared about enough to work on it for 100 years. So I know we're all looking to like maybe get an early exit and retire by the time we're like 22 or something. But the truth is, if you want to live a long time, you got to find something you care about. And it doesn't have to be this startup, but you got to find something that you can keep, that'll keep you engaged for a really long time. Other question was around pivoting. Why didn't we just exit? We had no revenue. So I could have exited just on IP, but it would have been a much smaller exit. And then how did I sort of realize, the first question was like, how did I start? Where did the pivot start?
No, it's more like, what are your exit strategy? What's your exit plan?
Yeah, selling to another company or IPOing. That's, by the way, the only answer to that question. VCs will ask you that. They'll be like, what's your exit strategy? There's only two ways for them to make money. A liquidity event, right? Which would include an IPO, or you selling to someone, right? Those are the only two things that will make them money. So I've taken VC money, therefore those are my answers to the question. Who it'll be, there's a lot of different parties it could be. It could be a real estate company because we just signed a deal with the largest real estate owner in New York. Like they could buy us one day. Could be a software company, right? Who wants to manage hybrid in a better way. It could be a private equity company. Or we could list publicly. Like, I don't know that answer. But it's good if you have revenue solves a lot of evils and it makes every other conversation you have much easier. All right, anyone else in there?
We've got time for maybe one more question.
What are some other startups that excite you out there?
Other startups that excite me. Interesting question. I'd like to think that we're all sort of trying to make the world a slightly better place. I think a lot of the climate tech stuff is super interesting today. I have some friends who have either done well or not done well, but are like, I'm changing my career. Like they either see a documentary or they read, or they're smarter than me. And they're like, we got to do something here. So I was just talking to a friend who's found a way to build, like, by the way, concrete is like the only building material. And they found a way to reduce carbon emissions by 30% in building that process, right? I think that's cool, right? Like, I don't know that that's going to reverse all the messed up stuff we've done historically, but I think it makes sense, right? I think if you can find a way to do something more efficiently, then that's great, as long as you don't sacrifice quality. So she's got one I think is really cool. They just won like some really cool, like, was it Venture X? I don't know what it was. There's some like huge grant. So I think that one's cool. I think anything that is helping, I don't know, there's a lot of problems to be solved that haven't even been touched, right? Like people who, I could list a ton, right? But around the world, there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of infrastructure issues. There's a lot of like famine and war. And like, I think anyone tackling any of those things, like, I'm a fan and I'd like to hear more. like real problems, you know, not like I'm doing, trying to make people slightly more efficient in what they do.
Awesome. One more question I'll ask too, kind of from there. Any book, you mentioned one book, I think, during our conversation, but any book or podcast recommendations for those on the line who are really interested in entrepreneurship?
Yes. Okay, I'll give you a fun book, it's called Chaos Monkeys, and that was written by an early engineer, well, not an early engineer, but it's like a pre-IPO Facebook story, which is sort of the equivalent of Liar's Poker, for anyone who has read something like that, but it's about sort of a tech equivalent of that. So that's a fun read. On sales, I think You Can't Teach a Kid to Ride a Bike at a Seminar is a very effective one. I read a lot of fiction. I'll be honest, like that for me, when I talked about self-care, like that's what I do. Like I went back, I'm reading a lot of like Albert Camus. Here we go. I got The Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen. There we go. Thank you. By the way, please keep chiming in. There's one called like Crossing the Chasm or Bridging the Chasm or whatever. That's super popular. Right. I'm sure you guys cover that in your curriculum. So, you know, I honestly draw a lot of my inspiration from like nature and from fiction because they find a really nice way to articulate stuff. So I like reading short stories. George Saunders is hands down my favorite author. And if you haven't read any of his stuff, I recommend it. It's very quick. Anyway, I know it's not going to help you build your startup, but it will sort of put you in a fun little universe for a few minutes that might take your mind off of something stressful that'll help you break through on whatever it is you're working on.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining us today. As I mentioned, anyone that's been listening in, we will send a survey afterwards. So please fill that out. It'll help us both gather feedback, but then also if there are certain topics that you're interested in, it can help us in bringing in different speakers. As I mentioned, this will be a monthly series. So we will be announcing our next speaker in the next couple weeks for next month, probably end of October. If you have not subscribed to the C4E newsletter, I highly recommend you go to www.vanderbiltc4e.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's where we'll send out announcements of all of our events that you can participate in. So I think somebody raised a hand. Is there something you want to say real quick before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the C4E connector and when you think like that will be like out and in the fuck that I read about it in the newsletter that it was coming this fall. I just didn't know like the specific dates and like how to get involved.
Yeah, awesome. So for those that aren't aware, we are launching this fall our C4E connector, which is actually an online platform that connects those within our ecosystem. So we'll announce events there, we'll host different events, we'll be able to access a directory of other people that are within the Vanderbilt entrepreneurial ecosystem. We'll have a job board where you could even potentially find, like if you're somebody who is a co-founder and wants to find a different co-founder. So there's a variety of different elements that'll be a part of that. More than likely, we're looking at the end of October. We're still finalizing the exact date. So we will announce the exact date coming up, but we are looking at the fall. So probably mid to late October. Thanks for asking.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I throw an offer ask out here? So I like to close events like this. So offer, we are looking for interns for this fall. So if anyone is interested in potentially working with us, like I'd love to. I'd love to learn more and get to know you a little bit. And then ask, we are closing out our latest fundraising round and we're doing it via crowdfund. And I'll tell you why. It's a really inexpensive customer acquisition tool that allows people to both invest in us, but also and be part of the community, but also support and be a part of the story here. So I'm going to drop a link to the fundraise in this. If anyone is interested in getting involved or chatting, I'd love to chat. That's what I'm here for. So otherwise, guys, really fun conversation. Thank you so much for having me. And if you didn't learn anything or you have follow-up questions or whatever, just email me, dan@kettleos.com. Happy to go deep with you. I think this stuff is I mean, it's my lifeblood. So I'd love to be as helpful to you as I can based on the information I have.
Amazing. Thank you again, Dan, and thank you everyone for being a part of this. And we will hopefully see you next month.